And hello, everybody. My name is Ric Gazarian, and we are here for a great live event to learn about the Principality of Sealand. If you are listening to us, feel free, do not be shy. Chime in on the chat room, chat box. Tell me where you are listening and watching from. We're going to be starting up in a minute or so. So good morning to West Coast USA. Good afternoon to East Coast, and good afternoon to Europe. I am actually in Bangkok. It is midnight here, so getting ready for early morning. So just want to welcome everybody to this great conversation that we're going to be having with the author, Dylan Taylor-Lehman, who wrote a fascinating book about the Principality of Sealand. Some people call it the smallest country in the world. So if you're listening to me right now, feel free to say hi and tell me where you're calling in from. So we have Maria, who is in Sofia, Bulgaria, a great country, in my opinion, underrated. It's 8 p.m. there. Thank you for staying up late and watching. And we'll be starting up in a couple more seconds, so thank you for your patience. Waiting for a couple more people to join us on this great event, which I think you're going to find fascinating. And in a moment, I'm going to be bringing in the author of this great book. Okay. And I hope you're as excited as I am to learn about the Principality of Sealand. I'm going to welcome Dylan. Hello, Dylan. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me on here. And greetings all over the world and solar system.
Yep, we don't want to leave out the solar system. Dylan, welcome. I am excited to hear about your journey of learning and discovering the amazing and unique Principality of Sealand. Before we go any further, in a nutshell, what is the Principality of Sealand?
Well, as you mentioned, the Principality of Sealand is considered by many people to be the smallest country in the world, but it's a pretty unusual country in that it is entirely man-made, established on an old naval fort 53 years ago tomorrow.
Okay, so a happy anniversary to Sealand tomorrow and to the royal family there. And also, Dylan, where is the Principality of Sealand?
The Principality of Sealand is approximately 7 miles off of the coast of southeastern England. And as mentioned, it's built on an old naval fort in the middle of the North Sea there. And it's kind of in a really populated shipping area. So a lot of its neighbors are big container ships and vessels of that sort. Okay,
excellent. So right to the east of the United Kingdom in the North Sea, which can be a chilly and rough waters in that area, that neck of the woods. Dylan, if you can introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Dylan Taylor-Lehman. I'm an author and writer originally from southeastern Ohio. I tend to write a lot about strange crimes and interesting subcultures, and so Sealand kind of fits right in there. I'm a huge fan of cats, and I also play guitar in some really noisy metal bands outside of writing.
Okay, noisy metal bands, guitar. Maybe if we have some extra time, you can whip out your guitar and play us maybe some Metallica at the end of our conversation. But Dylan, before we go any further, I want to take a moment and actually formally introduce myself. My name is Ric Gazarian. I'm an avid traveler. I've been to over 140 countries, and I'm on a quest to visit every single one of them. You can follow my journey on globalgaz.com and, of course, Facebook and Instagram. I also interview the most traveled people in the world. People who have traveled to all 193 countries on my podcast, Counting Countries. You can find that Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen. I'm also the chapter leader for Travel Massive. And let me tell you what Travel Massive is. Travel Massive is the largest online professional travel network in the world. And Travel Massive is the host of this great event tonight. They are sponsoring this content for you. There's over 60,000 members from the travel industry, and there's over 170 chapters in cities around the globe. And we have a mix of online virtual content like you're seeing today. And in better times when there was no COVID, we did awesome in-person events as well. So if you work in the travel industry, whether it's a hotel, you're a travel blogger, you're designing a travel app, you work at an airline, think about creating a profile for free on Travel Massive and networking with over 60,000 people. Also, one other thing, if you want to help support the community, you have the ability to donate and make a contribution right on the Travel Massive website page for this event. There's another group that is listening tonight as well. So I want to say hi to everybody from the Principality of Sealand Facebook group. In this group, we have over 1,300 supporters and citizens of the Principality of Sealand. So if you are fascinated with this group and you want to network with like-minded people, join this group. And a big thank you to George Day, the administrator, who welcomed us and this live stream to his group. But of course, we're here today to speak to the most important person. Dylan already introduced himself. He's an author, he's a reporter, but you need to read his book, Sealand, the true story of the world's most stubborn micronation, and over 50 years of history fighting against conformity. We're going to be hearing all about that tonight. You've heard the saying, fact is better than fiction. I've read the book. It is legitimately a fascinating, great read. Surprise, surprise. It's available on Amazon.com and other great retailers. So, Dylan, want to welcome you back. And I know there's 193 countries in the world as recognized by the United Nations. But what exactly is a micronation?
Well, a micronation is typically a self-declared country that is declared within the confines or within the borders of an already established country. And the reasons micronations exist range from sort of tongue-in-cheek role-playing adventures to more serious claims to disputed territory.
Okay, excellent. And can you give us a little physical overview of what this country looks like or what it is?
Well, as mentioned, Sealand is in the middle of the North Sea, which is a notoriously...
Okay, it looks like we're having our first technical difficulty. Can you hear me, Dylan?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay, welcome back. So we know it's in the North Sea. We know it's a micronation. Give us a little physical overview. What's this country look like? What's it feel like?
Well, as mentioned, it's built on an old naval fort, so it's an entirely man-made concrete and steel structure with a square footage about that of a small house. There are two massive concrete pillars that are hollow that have bedrooms, storerooms, the generators, that sort of thing. And across the top is a metal superstructure with more rooms and a kitchen and the decks and things like that. And you know, given that it is this man-made entity in the middle of the ocean, it can be subject to the elements. So being out there definitely requires, you know, a certain hardiness of spirit.
Okay, so bring your heavy winter jacket when you're visiting for Christmas. I want to say quick hello to Baron Sir Andrew Carl Carter of the Principality of Sealand. Thank you for joining us. And you and I have both had the awesome opportunity to be able to visit the Principality of Sealand. We've said it's in the North Sea. How do you get there?
Well, first, your port of entry might be flying to London and then taking a series of trains to a fairly small and low-key fishing village called Harwich, which is right on the coast there. And from there, you can see Sealand out on the horizon. And what I was fortunately able to do was hitch a ride on an old, on a sort of rickety lobster boat with one of the caretakers who was going out there to switch shifts. And so it was a fairly leisurely sail through the shipping corridor. And then once you approach the Principality, there is a winch up top that lowers down what looks like a wooden swing, and you have to be plucked from the boat you're on and raised up to the Principality. That or a helicopter ride, of course.
Okay, so that sounds unique to say the least. And how many miles off the shore is the Principality of Sealand?
Approximately 7 miles.
And how long does that boat ride take to get you out there?
Well, for the ride we took was about an hour and 20 minutes because, again, you're navigating some fairly trafficked shipping lanes. And so it's, again, fairly leisurely journey.
So 7 miles doesn't sound like that far off the coast, but 80 minutes is, somewhat of a lengthy boat ride. It's a somewhat isolated place in the North Sea. And then let's just make sure everybody understands this. The platform at Sealand is multi-feet off the ocean surface. There's no elevator. There's no staircase. There's no ladder. You have to jump off a boat onto a swing, and then you are brought up onto the platform. Is that a scary moment when you have to jump off the boat and get onto the swing, and then the winch pulls you up?
Well, the winch looks and sounds perhaps a little more intimidating than it is. I mean, granted, you are being raised, 40 to 50 feet in the air off of the boat, which can be pitching in the water. But, once you're on there, it gives you such a impressive view of your surroundings and the city on the horizon. So it's a fairly peaceful minute-long ride to the top.
Okay. And we have a quick 1-minute video we want to share with you that will give you an idea of what Dylan and myself are speaking about, because this is a truly unique place. So let's take a look at that video.
Sealand. I'm Prince Liam and this is Prince James.
Okay, hopefully that gives you a sense of what the Principality of Sealand is like. And I think it's safe to say there's not too many countries similar like that around the world. So, Dylan, you mentioned an anniversary coming up, but take us back in history. How does a country like this come to exist? Take us back 50 plus years. How did the Principality of Sealand begin to exist?
Well, the fort that would become the Principality of Sealand is a set of 4 forts that were built in the waters leading up to England to shoot down incoming Nazi bombers and submarines during World War II. And so they served a pretty valiant purpose during those years. They fell into disrepair essentially for the next 20 years until the 1960s, when a fairly unique phenomenon in the UK prompted some enterprising groups of people to take to the seas. And I'm assuming we can talk about the pirate radio era in a minute, but yeah, that is an integral part in both the UK's history and Sealand's foundation.
Okay, so you have these military fortifications built in the North Sea to fight the Nazis off during the war. So they're abandoned after World War II. They're sitting in the middle of the sea. What happens next?
Well, as it happened, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, at the time was the only licensed broadcaster in the UK. And so listeners were kind of at the mercy to whatever these radio stations, the BBC stations, were playing. And so since the BBC wouldn't play rock and roll, that prompted a bunch of kind of freewheeling businessmen and rock and roll types to establish these offshore radio stations in order to broadcast the music people wanted to hear. And of course, these freestanding forts made the perfect readout for a radio station. And so that's where the forts kind of got their second wind, was during this pirate radio era, as these quasi-legal and then overtly illegal radio stations.
Okay, so that's hard to imagine in 2020, right? We have Spotify, we have YouTube. You can basically listen to any song on demand. But what you're saying in the 1960s is BBC radio was the only place really to listen to music. And they weren't playing the Beatles and they weren't playing the Rolling Stones. So these entrepreneurs are going out to these military forts and setting up pirate radio. That's pretty amazing. So tell us what happens next in the next steps.
Well, this pirate radio phenomenon caught on pretty quickly and became a pretty lucrative enterprise, and that prompted a man named Roy Bates, who was Sealand's founder and its first prince, to form his own radio station. And he wasn't necessarily a rock and roll fan, but he saw the appeal in doing this, and he of course knew of these forts off of the coast of near where he lived, and so he put together his resources, got a crew of people together, and set up shop on one of the forts.
Okay, and Dylan, just so we can understand this a little bit better, when you said he got a crew together to take over one of the forts, what does that exactly entail?
Well, from what I understand, it was a bunch of very enthusiastic, 19, 20-year-olds who were eager to live this rock and roll lifestyle. And, they were perhaps willing to put up with some of the hardships of being on this fort. But again, this was a pretty popular and, almost Robin Hoodian enterprise, this pirate radio. And so there were no end of people, eager to take part in this fantastic adventure.
Okay, so they're on one of the forts. You said there's more than one, and he eventually moves from this fort to another fort. So talk about that transition and kind of what the next steps were in creating this country.
Well, and the book certainly goes into this in detail. I mean, just the numerous physical fights, the legal battles, all the crazy back and forth between competing radio stations, the British government, ultimately led to Roy Bates and his crew being barred from going on to the first fort because it was verifiably within British waters, according to a court decision. The fort that would become Sealand is a little further out. It was definitively outside of British waters and international waters, and so that made the logical next step. And so Roy picked up shop and settled again on a newer fort.
So just so we can understand this better, Dylan. So once you go out, I think it's about 7 miles or 5 miles, then you're technically not in the sovereign, under the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. So you're in international waters, meaning you don't have to follow the laws of England, meaning you can have a pirate radio station broadcasting in the United Kingdom and avoiding their broadcasting laws. Is that the gist?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, the territorial limit was only 3 miles, so it was even perhaps easier to evade those laws. Of course, the British government would pass laws of their own that, criminalize any participation in the pirate radio phenomenon. And so British citizens, back on land or when they return to land might be subject to these fines, but at least the broadcasting element was, again, outside of British jurisdiction.
Okay, so he makes it to the platform, the fort, which eventually becomes Principality of Sealand, and he just shows up and he announces it's a country, or what's the machinations behind this next step?
Well, by the time that he set up shop on this new fort, the fort would become Sealand. Laws had changed in the UK that allowed for more music to be played on the airwaves and kind of obviated the need for a new radio station. And so, setting up a new radio station just wasn't worth the effort. And so, given the difficulty he had with the British government and that he had successfully held on to this fort for a number of years, despite all of these fairly massive challenges, he wasn't interested in letting that go quickly. And so the next logical step to doing something with this extraterritorial fort was to endow it with statehood, to give it that extra, oomph when it came to international relationships.
Okay, so Roy Bates, on this day, when he declares it the Principality of Sealand, also becomes royalty. So he's no longer called Roy Bates. He is now Prince Roy Bates. And Dylan, I've read about him. Unfortunately, he's passed away. I mean, to say he sounds like a character is an understatement. Tell me a little bit about Prince Roy Bates. He's an amazing character.
Yeah, and it's a shame that he did pass away, because he's certainly somebody I would have really liked to have met. He was a pretty wild British war hero. It's said at one time to be the youngest major in the British Army. He'd seen all kinds of action all over the world, been blown up, shot, bitten by snakes, just all kinds of stuff like that. And once he returned, or once the war was over and he returned home to Southend, as they say about soldiers returning home, it's difficult to kind of adjust to the strictures of civilian life. And so, he embarked on a fairly extensive series of investments in all kinds of businesses. And then once the pirate radio era got up and running, that, proved to be the excitement he was looking for. And so he used all of his experience and resources and kind of wiles to found these radio stations and then Sealand.
So tell me a little bit more about this process. I mean, can you describe the day or the event? I'm guessing Prince Roy gathered his family on the platform, maybe some friends. I don't know. Was there a declaration? Was there what happened that day?
Well, and I should point out, of course, Princess Joan, Roy's wife's, role in all of this. I mean, massively helpful and crucial to the pirate radio enterprise. And then, of course, transforming the fort into a country. She had a huge hand in that as well. But so they and some friends and their two teenage kids, Michael and Penny, were on the fort for the occasion. Some supporters who had fought in the pirate radio battles were there, and they had a flag raising ceremony on the helipad, as you could see in the video that you showed. As far as I'm sure there were some speeches read aloud, but they definitely made sure to have some reporters there to capture the incident or the event. And there are some really cool photos of the inaugural flag raising ceremony on Sealand, which again is September 2nd, 1967. So happy 53rd to Sealand tomorrow.
Yeah, pretty amazing. This nation has existed for over 50 years. And also, I mean, just comment for a moment, Prince Roy and the royal family over the next couple of generations has been very effective of working with the media and garnering attention over the last 5 decades.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he kind of gained a lot of popular sympathy and support when he was being so persecuted as a pirate radio operator, and then also as the founder of Sealand. So there was always been this really kind of widespread support in what he's doing, and the fact that he is embarking on this endeavor. But I think the story itself kind of lends itself to some larger than life stories being written about it, and just a consistent interest in what it actually takes to keep this country running.
Yeah, just a unique character to say the least. I would have loved the opportunity to have met him one day, unfortunately. And touch on this for one moment, Dylan. The 1960s, the late 1960s, when they declared the Principality of Sealand, what's the living conditions like here? I mean, you noted it took you 80 minutes to get out there. So what's it like living out there?
Well, I think you were on a faster boat than me, because it definitely, no way, I guess it is an hour and 20 minutes, never mind. But yeah, the living conditions were rough to say the least. I mean, these forts had been abandoned for 20 years, so there was a lot of structural repairs that needed to be made. The pirate radio stations, a little bit of upkeep, but broadcasting was more important than making it very homey. So initially, I mean, it was freezing cold. I mean, people staying out there would pass out because it was so cold. The North Sea, the weather you're kind of stuck there at the mercy of it. And so, there were certainly times when the food they had stored ran out and they had to distill seawater and, kind of make these almost inedible biscuits out of seawater and flour. So, yeah, I mean, there was, for a long time, it was definitely, required some serious fortitude to be out there.
Yeah, definitely a struggle. A quick hello to Kelly in Montreal, and hello, good afternoon in Brazil to Pedro. And it looks like we have someone from England. Lorraine used to listen to pirate radio, Radio Caroline. That's pretty cool. I wonder if she ever knew the royal family. And Dylan, you've mentioned that Prince Roy had 2 children. And one of them is Prince Michael, who's a pretty amazing character in his own right. If you can, tell us a little bit about Prince Michael.
Yeah, I mean, Prince Michael, he, kind of a larger-than-life figure like his dad, kind of reminds me of a really lovable rogue from like a Guy Ritchie movie. But he started helping the family out with pirate radio when he was 13, 14 years old and dropped out of school to work full-time on this project. So, from a very early age, he was very willing participant in all of the Sealandic, or what would become the Sealandic adventures, took critical roles in a lot of the battles that took place out there. And so, yeah, I mean, just with that kind of upbringing, that's, that kind of informs, the sense of adventure that would define him, that continues to define him today.
Okay, I did hear you say battles, which I want to get to. But I also heard you say he dropped out of school when he was like 13 or 14. In some ways, he sort of grew up on Sealand. So again, only 7 miles off the coast, but an 80-minute boat ride. And I think at some points, the North Sea is so rough, you get stuck out there. So what was his teenage upbringing like on Sealand? I mean, it's pretty adventurous.
Yeah, I mean, as mentioned, it sometimes did entail, distilling seawater to survive, but other times, he was out there with just himself or another person, armed with guns and Molotov cocktails. So needless to say, that's, any teenage boy would appreciate something like that. But yeah, I mean, it also could be a quite a lonely experience. I mean, I think he said that he spent 6 consecutive months on Sealand, and probably a cumulative total of about 20 years of his life out there. So, I mean, it's a very, very serious about this endeavor and doing justice to his parents' project, and, doing risking blood, sweat, and tears to keep Sealand going for all of these years.
Dylan, I don't know if you can get into the mind of Prince Michael, but what's the motivation of a 15, 16, 17-year-old who's a teenager who is probably thinking about driving cars, meeting girls, sneaking some beers? What's his motivation to be out there at times by himself in really rudimentary conditions for a month, 2 months, and when things get tough, maybe 6 months?
I mean, I certainly can't speak for him, of course, but I think, the fact that the pirate stations were so widely listened to and respected, I mean, I think that was a certain amount, gave him a certain amount of bragging rights, but I think also just, he really looked up to his dad. And so the fact that he was with his dad on this, occasionally life and death adventure, I think really meant a lot. And, the fact that they were doing something so unique and challenging and fun, I think, certainly made the hardships worth it to take part in this enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, this has to be one of the most unique upbringings that I've ever heard of. It's, the equivalent of growing up on a desert island, except the desert island is an old steel military fortification in what can be the very cold North Sea.
I should point out real quick that, just to kind of illustrate his upbringing, he told me that his dad left the decision about whether or not to use lethal force up to him when he was 14. And so, reflecting on that when we spoke last year, he was kind of blown away by being endowed with such a grave responsibility. But again, that's just part of the Sealand story.
Okay, and let's try and unpack that for a moment, because we've heard of some of the fisticuffs that took place during the pirate radio days. I've heard you say defending Sealand in battles, and you just said lethal force. So what's going on exactly? Who are they defending themselves from? Who are they using lethal force on? What's going on in Sealand?
Well, my superficial reading of the pirate radio era was that it was just like kind of rock and roll adventure. But obviously, when there's a lot of money involved, that can kind of change your perspective on things. And so, opposing pirate ships were bombed, or somebody ended up being shot to death in England over this. So all that to say, when you have a fort in international waters that you can broadcast from, that's a valuable commodity. And so there were, throughout Roy Bates's tenure on the forts, an unending series of competing radio stations trying to take it over, police coming to try to get them off. And then in the 1970s, which I'm sure we'll talk about, there was a whole coup attempt that ended up taking Prince Michael hostage. So yeah, the first couple of decades, getting Sealand established were kind of like that of any country, where you're really trying to muscle your way onto the national stage, and you have all these people kind of opposed to that, and you have to stick through all these challenges.
Okay, so Dylan, let's talk about one of those incidences. And thankfully, Prince Michael did not have to use lethal force. But I believe in some of the earlier days, he was shooting his weapon as warning shots for approaching or nearby boats and ships. Share with us one of those examples.
Yeah, and an event like that, where he did fire some warning shots at a boat that was going to refill a nearby buoy with oil. The end result of that was he and his dad were arrested next time they set foot in England, and ultimately had to appear before a judge who, after a couple of hours of arguments from their solicitors, determined that based on where the fort was, which was Ruff's Tower, which would become Sealand, Britain did not have jurisdiction out there. And so that kind of shocking admission from a British government official, really did a lot to credit the fact that they were in fact a sovereign entity. And for better or worse, were kind of left to their own affairs. So yeah, that's these struggles ultimately counted as something very much in favor of Sealand's sovereignty.
Okay, so just an interesting note there, so that we can grasp that. He fired at a ship, a nearby ship, but he was arrested. But at the end of the day, the court said, we can't prosecute you. We can't put you in jail. This took place in international waters. We don't have jurisdiction over here, which leads people to think the Principality of Sealand is a sovereign nation, because it does not necessarily have to follow the laws of the United Kingdom. Interesting, but let's jump ahead. Sealand has been the object of opportunists, of collaborators, of partners, of schemes. At some point in the 1970s, I know the government grew, and I know in 1976 was a pivotal time in Sealand's history. Walk us through those events.
Yeah, I mean, just like in the pirate radio era, a lot of people ended up wanting a piece of this fort, given its now, sovereign status. And so Sealand was always, kind of hit up with various offers for establishing businesses or kind of crazy ideas that would take advantage of its international status, which were typically rebuffed. But the Bates family did start working with a group of primarily Germans starting in the early 1970s, who were pretty active about petitioning governments of pretty much every other country in the world in the UN for recognition, and trying to do a lot to get some sort of official a more established nation's approval of Sealand. But ultimately, their motivations became clear when they began acknowledging that they were looking to expand Sealand's footprint for sort of, some somewhat nefarious money laundering purposes, or, kind of working to their own ends. And that led to, in 1978, one of the most pivotal events in Sealand's history.
Okay, this sounds a little bit like Game of Thrones here. But what took place then? Walk us through those events.
Well, long story short, Michael, who was then around 26, 27, was alone on the fort doing, guard duty. A helicopter arrives full of some of the men that his parents had been working with. He got a little weirded out, but, offered to give him something to drink in order to get him to leave. They ended up throwing him in an iron closet, taking him hostage, tying him up, depositing him in Holland a few days later after roughing him up a bit, and then declared the fort to be now in their possession. So Michael had to make his way back to England and figure out a way to get the fort back.
Okay, so if I'm hearing this correctly, what you're describing is an actual coup d'etat. So this group kicked out the royal family from the Principality of Sealand to claim it as its own. That's pretty amazing. So Prince Michael ends up back in England after a quick diversion to Holland. Probably a little shell-shocked, but he's definitely a tough character. I think he teams up with his dad and explain to us what happens next.
Yeah, and he notes that his parents' first reaction was to be mad at him for not fighting harder to hold on to Sealand. But after that anger dissipated, they realized they had to do what they could to take it back. And so fortunately, his dad was friends with a guy who was a stunt pilot who had appeared in James Bond movies. They got in a helicopter. Michael tied a shotgun to his neck. They got some pistols that Roy had hidden from after the war, and flew out to Sealand to counter coup d'etat, as Michael put it. So it was a very serious helicopter raid where they're actually armed to the teeth and fly out to Sealand.
Okay, and I did state earlier that fact is better than fiction, and this story is pretty amazing. A coup d'etat of the coup d'etat. I'm just picturing Prince Michael and Prince Roy rappelling off this helicopter, claiming back the Principality of Sealand for their royal family. Once they recapture it, what do they do with the guys who had kicked Prince Michael off earlier?
Well, obviously, tempers were a little high. So once the invaders acquiesced, they in turn were roughed up a bit and kind of paraded for the reporters who had sailed out there when they got wind of what was going on. A few of them were kicked, deported and banned from Sealand, while another, the guy who was accused of being the ringleader was tried in Sealandic court and made to stay on the fort. Which would entail a whole other series of diplomatic adventures as well.
Okay, so I believe the gentleman was tried for treason, found guilty, and at some level imprisoned on Sealand, and eventually kept as some sort of manservant at the Principality of Sealand. So I believe he was a German national, or technically he's a dual citizen of Germany, Principality of Sealand. How does he get out of this rather difficult and unpleasant situation?
Yeah, and that's why the charges against him were so serious, because he was a dual citizen. He was accused of being a traitor, which, required this extra sort of judicial step. But Roy spared him the death penalty, and instead, he was made to make coffee and clean the toilets and other menial tasks. And so I think he was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and $18,000 fine. But thanks to the intercession of a member of the German embassy in London, who legitimately flew out to Sealand to negotiate this prisoner's release, they ultimately, his sentence was greatly reduced. But again, this necessitated a visit from essentially a German diplomat, which again, greatly counts in favor of Sealand's recognition as a sovereign entity.
Okay, so pretty amazing. As you just stated, a German diplomat has to go to the Principality of Sealand to negotiate the release of this this traitor from the Principality of Sealand. Again, another example is the Principality of Sealand, a sovereign nation. So fascinating story. And again, it sounds a little bit like Game of Thrones to me. Hopefully HBO will be making a mini series of the Principality of Sealand. But let's go look at another controversy. There's another fascinating series of events which took place in the 1990s in regards to Sealandic passports. Principality of Sealand at one time was issuing passports. What happened then?
Yeah, this is definitely one of my kind of favorite chapters from Sealandic history. And I should preface this by saying that what follows happened without the knowledge of the Bates family and the Sealand supporters. But what happened was a group of international con men essentially exploited Sealand's status and, its aspects of statehood to try to orchestrate all kinds of wild scams all over the world, from selling fake doctorates and other titles to, even trying to use, Sealand statehood as a way to facilitate the purchase of missiles to sell to Sudan from the Russian mob. So, this massive series of scams, again, sort of trafficking on Sealand's name.
Okay, pretty fascinating. These passports are showing up everywhere and trying to be used in commercial transactions, government transactions. What do people think when they see one of these Sealandic passports slid across the desk?
There are certainly lots of stories of people traveling with their Sealand passport without an issue. Maybe just border checkpoints aren't being terribly vigilant. I think that was years past, and the Sealanders have long since stopped issuing passports given these problems that arose. But when I visited, was fortunate enough to get a Sealand stamp in my passport, and I was secretly hoping that might cause some kind of issue crossing a border, but nothing like that happened. And so I think if you have a Sealand stamp in your passport, that shouldn't be an issue, though. If you do try to, if you come into contact with a Sealand passport and try to travel with it, you might be perhaps kind of inviting a little more trouble.
Okay. A quick hello to Lady Catalina from North Devon, a citizen from the Principality of Sealand, and a quick bonjour to Zeta from Mauritania in West Africa. So thank you both for joining us. Now, Dylan, one of these passports ended up being in the media because of someone went on a murder spree that ended up killing a celebrity in Miami. Yeah, another crazy story involving Sealand. What happened here?
Yeah, and I shouldn't laugh at that. Obviously, all sympathies to the victims. But yeah, this is how this whole international passport scam sort of became exposed to the world, was that in 1997, this psychopath killed a bunch of people and then assassinated fashion designer Gianni Versace outside of his home in Miami. And when this killer ran from police, a few days later was tracked down to this houseboat where he ultimately committed suicide. But on this houseboat was a Sealand passport, and the boat belonged to a guy who was possibly most likely connected to these German scammers who, presented himself as a Sealandic diplomat. And so, yeah, for a while, police, Interpol, FBI were trying to were scratching their heads, trying to figure out how this all related to Sealand. But I think it was, again, just a, kind of a bootleg passport that ended up in the wrong hands and inadvertently got caught up in this extremely bizarre crime.
Dylan, for those who follow Sealand history, the stories we shared are pretty well known. You did a lot of research for this book. Any story or anecdote you can share with us that people won't be as familiar with?
Yeah, one of the things that was so compelling and surprising to me was really how much of a threat the British government considered Sealand when it was getting off the ground. I mean, in the UK National Archives, there were just really extensive plans for helicopter raids, marine raids on boats to try to get the Bates family off. And so when those were deemed to be, too risky, various government departments sent agents to try to negotiate with Roy Bates to, almost like slapstick results, like butting heads. And, they offer him $5,000 or 5,000 pounds. He counter offers with 100,000 pounds to buy him off. And the British government even tried to convince one of his former associates to turn against him and take over the fort, through whatever means he could. And that ultimately blew up in the government's face when this former associate went to a newspaper and revealed this whole clandestine plan that they were trying to carry off against Sealand. And, to prove that this was legitimate, the newspaper dialed the phone number that this guy was given and in fact went to, I think it was a naval general, but at any rate, went to some high up in the British military. So they were quite serious about it. But yeah, I mean, the Bates family was just able to kind of outfox these attempts at every turn. So I think that was really, I didn't realize just how complex this like cat and mouse game was. So that was really interesting to me.
So yeah, I mean, it's compelling, it's humorous, but at some level, it sounds like the Principality of Sealand has been a thorn in the side for the British government. And you're saying it's going up to high levels of government officials who are having to deal with the royal family. So just fascinating what the royal family has been able to accomplish. And speaking about the family, we spoke about Prince Roy, the founder of the Principality of Sealand, Prince Michael, his son, who's been so instrumental in keeping this country active and alive. And there's a third generation, which is taking over the reins. Tell me a little bit about Prince James and Prince Liam.
Yeah, as you saw in the video that you played, there you go. They're in their early 30s, and yeah, they're Michael's sons, and they too have grown up sort of on Sealand, and they're the movers and shakers primarily today who have a good grasp of social media and marketing in that respect, and so they've kind of given newfound prominence to Sealand by really publicizing it well and having a lot of fun with its history, on the internet, and really kind of updating its money-making ventures successfully.
And as we mentioned earlier, Dylan, is the royal family is pretty good at working with the press and leveraging it for their advantage. Mm-hmm. And also my understanding at some level, I mean, they're not on Sealand, 365 days a week. They're obviously in the mainland in England as well. So are they celebrities? Are they known when they're walking around town? What's it like being a Prince Liam, a Prince James, strolling around the neighborhood or going out to a restaurant?
I mean, one thing that, I found kind of interesting about this was, they live in Southend, and they run a fishing business with their dad, harvesting these mollusks. And so, a lot of people in the area knew them much more readily from their fishing business than they did as Sealanders, but they certainly do get recognized as the Princes of Sealand. And, the one kind of funny anecdote about growing up as a Sealander, they told me that, if they start dating somebody, they have to kind of mull over, how do you break the news that you're a prince on this extraterritorial platform, and, get into that whole story. But fortunately, it's widely known enough that, their partners have kind of known about that beforehand, and it kind of prevented like a shocking conversation.
Okay. So for those interested, Prince James is married. Prince Liam, from my understanding, is single. I'd be curious to see what his Tinder profile says and if there's any reference to being a prince at the Principality of Sealand. Dylan, we've gone over a couple of examples where, you look at the Principality of Sealand and it's a small steel platform in the middle of the North Sea. But then we hear situations of they're not under the jurisdiction of British law. A German diplomat has to negotiate the release of a Sealandic citizen. I mean, you can joke or laugh about it, but to me that sounds pretty serious that this might be a real nation. So let's touch on that a little bit. And one other thing to hone in on is you've also mentioned it's in international water. So is it 12 miles? Is it 3 miles? Give us a quick overview of how this works.
Well, since Sealand was founded, the kind of globally accepted territorial limit is 12 miles, which of course encompasses Sealand, though Sealand expanded its territory proportionally to now encompass part of England. But, kind of international norms and customs for what is a territory, what has the potential to become a state, are often change and are somewhat malleable and aren't typically applied consistently. So at the very least, Sealand certainly has a very compelling academic argument for statehood. I mean, it does fulfill a lot of the qualifications that previous countries that have been recognized have met. So there are numerous events throughout its history and its physical being that do count in its favor for sure. Of course, the argument could be made against all of that, but that's why there are tons of scholarly papers debating Sealand's status and a few other territories like that.
Excellent. And Dylan, besides what we've documented again, with the legal jurisdiction not applying to Sealand at that time, Sealand, the Principality of Sealand, has so many other trappings of a nation. You mentioned you got a visa stamp when you went and visited the Principality of Sealand. So they have a visa, they have currency, they have stamps, they have a flag. Touch a little bit on all these different trappings. They have a constitution. So touch a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as Sealand got up and running, of course, they needed to establish themselves as a viable entity, a viable country. And so, flag, passport, stamps, coins, national anthem was written a few years ago, which is a pretty rousing bit of music. So, I mean, they've sort of made an effort to definitely meet all of these sort of superficial needs, or at least the needs that countries have to operate by taking care of all those concerns.
And that was a photo of the Director of Homeland Security, Mike, who is reviewing some passports and getting ready to put the stamp for the Principality of Sealand in some visitors' passports in this photo. We'll talk about Mike a little bit later. He's another fascinating character. Besides these trappings like currencies and the flag and the national anthem, which you can easily hear on YouTube by searching for that, talk a little bit. I've given a couple of shout outs tonight to Lady Catalina and to Sir Carlos and Baron Sir Andrew Carl Carter. What's this mean? What am I talking about? Who are these people?
Well, one of the primary contributors to Sealand's gross national or its annual budget are the sale of titles such as lordships, baroncies, dukedoms, things like that, and those can all be purchased through sealandgov.org, which is the official website of the Principality. And these titles not only kind of bring you into the Sealandic community, but also go a long way to keeping Sealand sustainable and up and running and taking care of all the the myriad bits of work that go into keeping the country afloat.
Okay, so Sir Carlos, Baron Sir Andrew, Lady Catalina, thank you so much for supporting the Principality of Sealand. And as Dylan said, you can go to their website and be a part of the royal family, as well as supporting this great island nation. One of the other trappings of a nation around the world is participating in sporting events. Unfortunately, the Principality of Sealand is not in the Olympics, but for instance, I understand someone has summited Mount Everest holding the flag of Sealand. So talk about this and some of the other sports that you see people from the Sealandic community participating in.
Yeah, this is actually a photo of a guy summiting, and I'm sorry if I get this pronunciation incorrect, but Mutsag Ata, which is in China. He was able to go and he stowed away a homemade Sealand flag to bring glory to Sealand that he unfurled when he reached that summit. But yeah, I mean, people all over the world have been really eager to compete in Sealand's name for, their respective sports. So people have won Kung Fu championships for Sealand. They've scaled mountains. There's an egg throwing contest that had Sealandic representation. Skateboarders skated on Sealand. A guy even swam from Sealand back to the shore of the UK. So yeah, I mean, I think being able to take part in this underdog story is definitely, if you're a serious athlete, that's certainly worth doing.
Okay, so a lot of pride being able to represent the Principality of Sealand and some of these international sporting events. It'd be pretty amazing one day to see them in the Olympics. We just touched on this for a moment. We spoke about how you can support Sealand by buying titles. But talk to me, I mean, this is a big structure, and you said it, it's been in existence since World War II. And it's in the North Sea, which is rough elements. How's this work financially?
That's where the sale of not only the titles but various other bits of merchandise, Sealand merchandise, come into play. I mean, again, being in the middle of the ocean, you're subject to the elements, so there's a lot of superficial work that needs to be done. But the Sealandic family also pays two caretakers as their full-time job to stay out on Sealand. And so, yeah, it's certainly a huge expense, and that's been, a present concern in the Sealandic story since it was founded. I mean, at one point, Michael had to have his house repossessed in order to pay for Sealand. So, I mean, it's a serious venture, but fortunately, thanks to the internet age, and again, Prince James and Prince Liam, they're very good about kind of garnering support for Sealand all over the world, and helping now to realize Roy's dream, which is making Sealand a self-sustaining operation. So fortunately, things are definitely looking up for the Principality in that regard.
Okay, kudos to the royal family. We have a great question from Maria. You shared with us, I mean, it's in some ways Prince Michael grew up on the Principality of Sealand, and he was out there for, sometimes several months by himself. So how does that work? Does Prince Michael live there? Does Prince James and the princess live there? Does Prince Liam live there? Is there someone there at all times? Break that down for us.
Today, the Bates family does not fully live on the fort. I mean, certainly visit it when they need to. But again, they have two full-time caretakers that alternate at the very least 2-week shifts out there. And then, they care for Sealand on a day-to-day basis. It's upkeep, it's keeping it up and running, repelling invaders if need be. But the Bates family is obviously still very closely involved with the governing of Sealand and the direction it takes from here on out.
Okay, so there's at least always one person at all times over the last 50 years has someone been on the Principality of Sealand. And, we need to give some credit to the two people you just referenced, the caretakers. Who are these caretakers? They're an integral part of sustaining the Principality. Tell me a little bit about these two gentlemen.
Yeah, you showed a picture of Mike earlier, who is it was involved with the pirate radio era of the 70s. So he's, very ideologically in line with what Sealand is about. And he's been a good friend. He was a good friend of Roy Bates and has been very dedicated and involved with Sealand for the past 3 decades. Very incredibly knowledgeable mechanically and just a really remarkable tinkerer. And so a lot of Sealand's modern accoutrements are thanks to this caretaker, Mike. And then Joe kind of fell into being a caretaker on Sealand about 10 plus years ago when he was invited to be a security for this Red Bull skateboarding event, and just realized that there's a peculiar charm to being out there, as kind of terrifying as it might initially be. And so, if you're the kind of person that is totally at peace with your own mind and like your solitude, then definitely this is the job for you.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's so many stories to tell. I mean, Red Bull and skateboarding, but we'll leave that for for people to read the book. And let's talk about the book for a moment. What was your inspiration for, dedicating a big chunk of your life to writing this fascinating account of Sealand?
And let me just show off the American edition here, which came out in June. So cheers to that. But I don't know, just as an avid reader and an avid narrative nonfiction fan, I realized that the Sealand story is exactly the kind of book that I would like to read, because there are just all of these wild branches, again, involving crimes, this cool family dynamic, just an unending amount of stories that are, all equally interesting. And Prince Michael did publish his autobiography, which is a very personal account of being from Sealand. And so I realized that I would like to read a more journalistic account of the history that takes into account, some of the context and stuff like that. And so I set out to pen sort of a counterpart to Michael's book that tells some of their stories, but also goes into the history of the forts, the pirate radio era, these widespread crimes, and arguments for statehood and things like that.
And we touched on how people have been trying to, in essence, get a piece of Sealand throughout the generations, whether a partnership or kind of a criminal partnership attempted, but they get hundreds of emails every day. I mean, they are extremely popular. How did you break through?
I think I just pestered them enough over the course of, a year or two, that they saw some merit in the project I was attempting to undertake. And gradually, they warmed up to me in this idea and, started sharing with me some anecdotes, and just, we kind of built up a relationship that way. And then going to England to do research for this book, they were gracious enough to meet me. And so I was able to realize part one of a dream come true, which was meeting the Bates family and, not only speaking with them, but picking their brain about obscure Sealand questions that I'd come across in my research.
And I'm sure at some level it was kind of, I don't know if I want to use the word dream coming true, but I mean, it still had to be very cool and fascinating after reading and researching and emailing so long. What was it like to meet Prince Michael in person?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was definitely, nervous approaching his apartment building in South End, where he had invited me to meet he and his wife. But yeah, opening when he opened the door, it was kind of shocking to see this person. I'd seen in photos of him and as a kid, videos of him as an adult, standing before me. But he was he and his wife were a very gracious host, he's a very gregarious guy, and answering my questions and just filling me in on all kinds of cool stuff. And then meeting he and his sons again a few days later was equally cool to get their perspective on all of this and just learn more about their lives and what they do.
Pretty cool. I think a lot of people in the Sealand community might be a bit envious that you had that great opportunity. Dylan, in the Travel Massive community, we have a ton of content creators. A lot of people are self-publishing their works, whether on Amazon or just to a PDF. You have a real publisher. This is a real book launch. Talk to us a little bit about the business end of how you're able to secure a book deal with a publisher.
Well, I think you definitely need to have a lot of patience and persistence because, the writing world moves very slowly at times. So, getting this book off the ground was truly a years-long process. But we're, for a work of like this, narrative nonfiction, research-heavy nonfiction, what you need to do is put together a book proposal that outlines what your book is chapter by chapter, the research you're going to do, why this book's necessary, who you're going to talk to. You really have to kind of make the case for why you should be not only why you should write this book, but what point this book will serve. And so fortunately, after I don't even know how many agents I sent this to, I mean, dozens, if not 100, numerous form rejection letters if I got a response at all. But fortunately, my agent Amanda was very interested in this project and realized that there was a very cool niche of micronational history that this book would fulfill. And so we began working together to get this book into shape to shop to publishers. And fortunately for nonfiction, you don't, because it is research heavy and interview heavy, you don't have to have the full book written like you might with a novel. So once I got this deal in place to get the book published, we discussed the amount of time I would need, which I think was a year, to finish up my research and writing and the travels I needed, and then turn in a manuscript of the book. So, from getting this proposal together to getting the book published, I would say it was probably at least 3 or 4 years, to say nothing of my kind of sustained interest in Sealand preceding that led me to want to write this book. So I would definitely say, look for areas in your respective subjects that don't have a lot of coverage, because I think that serves a good purpose, but also, believe in your idea and don't give up even if you never hear anything back from the majority of people you write to, because eventually, somebody will become interested in this. And even if they don't pick it up, the feedback that they'll give you will be extremely helpful in getting it into better shape, and hopefully somebody will pick it up. So very lengthy, but beneficial process, as far as learning about the writing world goes.
Okay. Well, giant time commitment. We're going to be finishing up here. And since you put in so much blood, sweat, and tears into writing this book, share with us the name of the book once again, where you can buy it.
Yeah, the book is, full title is Sealand, the true story of the world's most stubborn nation and its eccentric royal family. And that is available through the publisher in the US, Diversion Books, in England, Icon Books, and essentially every online retailer. And your bookstore, your local bookstore should be able to send you a copy as well. And I was fortunate enough somebody sent me a picture of my book in my hometown library in Zanesville, Ohio. So cheers to that as well.
Okay, that's very cool. Dylan, thank you so much for your time today. It's fascinating to learn more about this fabulous micronation. Thank you, everybody from the community, from joining us, whether that was Travel Massive, who hosted this great event, our great friends in the Facebook group Principality of Sealand, and everybody who joined me on GlobalGaz. So, Dylan, any last words before we part ways?
No, I mean, thank you immensely to the Bates family and the caretakers and everyone involved for allowing me to take part in this, and also cheers to my friends and family watching. But also, please feel free to visit my website, which is theyawningchasm.com, which has a collection of my writings, again, about all kinds of strange crimes and other topics that might be of interest. And then I'm also on Instagram at Shakespeare_sucks.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dylan, and we'll be signing off. And Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this fabulous conversation.